Okay. So we might kick off. I'll just admit people as they come along, but I'm conscious of everyone's time. I'll just start off with a little brief introduction before I hand you over to Rosie. My name's Aoife Banks. I'm the curator of Luan Gallery. And I'd just like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us this afternoon for our lunchtime talk with Rosie O'Reilly. Rosie will be delivering a talk on her artistic practice and her work currently on show at Luan Gallery as part of the group exhibition Athrú and Invocation, which ends this Sunday, the 3rd of September. Today's talk is the last of our online artist talk series for the Luan Gallery Climate Outreach Programme, which is kindly supported by Creative Westmeath. This programme forms part of phase 1 of Luan Gallery's 3-year strategy, focusing on climate change, Irish ecology, biodiversity and sustainability. This 3-year project aims to instigate meaningful engagement between artists, artwork and the publics in our county and on a national level. And this Thursday on the 2nd of September, we'll be hosting our final event for Luan Gallery's 2023 Climate Outreach Programme. Teresa Dillon, whose work is currently exhibited in Luan Gallery as part of the group exhibition Athrú and Invocation, will be hosting the workshop Thinking with Plants, a guided visual meditation as a form of collective writing for plant species. And this workshop is going to be held between 3 and 5 p.m. It'll take the form of a guided visual meditation, which is rooted in the form and life cycle of Irish bog reeds. Following the meditation, participants will be asked to write, share, or record the impressions and sensations that emerged while meditating. These recorded sensations will become part of a collective poem that will be co-created on the day. And this workshop is suitable for and can accommodate all bodies from ages 12 plus. Booking is essential. If you can email info@luangallery.ie, check out our website or our social media channels to book your spot. It's free for all. So before I introduce Rosie, I'd just like to remind everybody that this talk is being recorded and will be uploaded to Luan Gallery's YouTube channel along with our previous artist talks. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and Rosie will get to them at the end. And the talk will last about 40 minutes with about 20 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So just a little bit about Rosie. Rosie works across sound, sculpture, writing and performance, operating at the intersection of art and science, and through embedded research, her practice starts with the values of interspecies coexistence, social justice and care. She works speculatively with vernacular knowledge held close at hand as the tool to make evident that science and technology must coexist with ancient knowledge. Drawing on mythology and entangled with the more than human world, she tries to get closer to different thought systems, and in doing so, create space and shelter for new collaborative narratives and forms of world making. So welcome, Rosie, and I'll just ask everybody to make sure your audio and your video are turned off. So Rosie, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Aoife. Gormagat. Igwit gachdina. I will just share a screen. Okay, cool. Everyone can see that. So lovely entanglements in this show Athrú with Mark and with Teresa. And Aoife just touched on their work, and I got to see their presentations as well. So it was really nice to be part of that with great artists who were working in similar veins, and the conversation and overlaps were a big part of what made it. So for this presentation, for this talk, I'm going to talk about the two bodies of work, or the two series of works that are in Athrú, and also then talk through Idirlin, which was one of the solo shows last year that the 2 or 3 of the works came from. So I think it's interesting, and maybe Aoife will touch on it afterwards, to just look back at the kind of paragraph on Luan website this morning that describes Athrú. And of course, it's a word in Gaeilge that means change. And both Teresa and Mark and myself talked a little bit about this at the opening, about how art as a way of thinking or a mode of doing is this kind of hybrid space that allows you shift and change and move between disciplines in a way that's really powerful from the point of view of discussing the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene or climate change or the social environmental stories of our time. Athrú, I suppose, means change, but if you're saying in Gaeilge, if you wanted to say a great change came upon you, you would say Honeg Athrú more earth. And of course, that's the great power of Gaeilge, which Aoife, you might talk a little bit more at the end about maybe where the thinking for the exhibition came from, but the idea that you have a change upon you, that it came upon you. And I think that's one of the things that Mark and myself and Teresa were talking about, is how your art practice, when you work with materials, is really about that journey through a material. And transformation and metamorphosis are evident throughout all the works in the show. And I think that kind of is a nice nod to the word itself, but also the power of Gaeilge as a language to really nail things when it describes what we need right now in terms of the time and space we're in on. We need a great change to come upon us, I suppose, to engulf us, maybe not just to happen, to engulf us and take us with it as we face the challenges of the Anthropocene or of climate breakdown, of ecocide, of the many stories of our times. So as a little intro, I suppose maybe I'll touch on the first slide here. Let's just do this as a slideshow. So just to kind of delve a bit deeper into that in my own practice, this is the drawing I did when I was reading Staying with the Trouble, Donna Haraway's great text. And she's describing that type of thinking that we need to I think the way she frames it is to break the bad geometry of the past. What type of new thinking do we need to get away from the linear, to move beyond the linear and into something deeper? What I call, well, she would use the word herself, but the mesh. So she uses the octopus, the great tentacular thinker, as a way to describe that. This was a sketch I drew of this, what I see now as kind of like similar to a sponge-like space that is infinite, that has many layers, that when you're in it, you're slightly confused, but that is a place of possibility with no definite background or foreground. It has hardness and softness at the same time. And this is very different to the type of linear thinking that has emerged out of what we know as advanced capitalism. And this is a space that Donna, Anna Zing, all the great thinkers and a lot of the feminist ecologists that we would embed ourselves in now to explore this are echoing, that we need to really enter this space. Sorry, one sec. There's the arrow. So for Athrú, I decided with Aoife to show these images, which are prints from 2000, and they're ongoing, but they began in 2019. And they are called Strangers in a Middle World, Part 1. And these are all black and white images that I took on a residency in a marine institute called CIIMAR in Porto. That's quite blurred, but this is what it looked like. So this was a really fascinating place to be. They'd never had an artist in residency before, but this is actually on the top floor of this building. Our genetics labs. On the basement, there is ecology labs, and in the middle there is the port where people are going in and out on boats. So you have literally a kind of visual sort of mesh, a visual kind of melting point of all these different nature, human crossovers. And of course, ports are one of the biggest currently one of the biggest forces of kind of forced migration of species worldwide. Bilge water would contain a huge number of species that are transported around the world in the bellies of the ships that are crossing the ocean and then dumped in different ports. So this space became a really interesting space to look at ideas around nature, culture, crossovers. And while I was there, they were studying sea urchins. So in the lab itself, this is a video taken in the lab when we were working with the collection of sea urchins from the coastline of Portugal. But they were studying sea urchins and stress testing them in the lab to see how quickly they would change their behavior based on pH levels rising and falling, but also temperature of the water rising. So in this experiment here, you can see they're in these small tanks, and the pH level is being incrementally changed. So this is to get an idea of how quickly the sea urchin will be moving around the coast of Portugal, and also different coastlines as you move. They were working with the Spanish marine labs, and also working with marine labs in the UK and in Galway. So sea urchins right now are one of the big predators of kelp and of kelp forests. And because of the removal of sea otters from ecosystems, from our own kind of human behavior, you've ended up with sea urchins dominating in these ecosystems and destroying kelp forests. And a kelp forest is the equivalent of a rainforest under the water in relation to kind of how it will keep the ecosystem in balance. So they were looking at the movement of these sea urchins and stress testing them in the lab. So they were also looking at the movement of a Japanese kelp. So a Japanese seaweed had come in on oysters back in the late 90s. So the oyster farms failed in France and Spain. And they brought Japanese oysters in to substitute the farms very quickly. But at that time, they weren't scanning the surface of the shells. So what they ended up doing was importing the spores of kelp that was then brought into the waters of Portugal, and has since moved and is visible on the Irish coast, Kilmore Quay, and moving southeast around the coast. And it's a very dominant kelp, and in the waters of Ireland does very well and is taking over the ecosystems of that area. So when I got to the lab, I began studying this seaweed kelp and going out monitoring it with the different marine biologists and the geneticists. And at the same time, discussions around borders were and are hugely prevalent in Europe. And I'd been to Calais to work in the camps there, volunteering for a period of time before I went. And there was an Irish word actually that kept appearing in kind of research I was doing called muracuia. And it was a word I used in a previous, it was the title of a previous body of work. But it literally translates as thrown up by the sea. And it would have been an old Irish word for foreigner or alien. And it just was this reflection for me on this place that the ocean plays in now in the conversations around borders, but also in our own conversations around how we're changing ecosystems, and particularly around advanced capitalism and the impact it's having on the ocean. And it was in the lab, this discussion around this invasive species really stayed within the qualitative realm, or the quantitative realm, where it was about data collection and it was about response. It was about kind of monitoring what this species would do, how it would react to pH, and how ecosystems would be effective. But the discussion around invasiveness, or what an invasive species was never there. So as an artist, as artist in residency, I decided that how I would respond in the space, I would try and be an invasive species in the space they were in. So what I did was started data collecting myself, and I gathered the seaweed and was using black and white film, and with a local chemist who was a photographer, we used the seaweed itself to become a developing agent for all the images that were taken in the lab. He grew a bio photography garden, so we were developing with caffeinol, also with thyme and spearmint, thyme and mint, and then with the collection of the seaweed, I was able to test the pH and work out that I could use this as a printing agent. So all the images I took in the lab ended up being printed with the seaweed itself, and presented back then to the scientists as a reflection. I also was interested in the conversations around, I suppose, extractive genetic practices, where what you realize very quickly in these labs is, like everything in this model, whoever controls the information flow has power. And when it came to the genetics conversations around genetic collection, it was clear that like the powers of dominance, in many cases, kind of Western collection models of genetic data, were proliferating databases that people that the access to was restricted. And again, that reverberated the kind of power dimension in who had access to the genetic makeup of the invasive species, or also just the ecology of a space. So I actually decided then that I'd ask them, I wanted to test the ethics of data collection with genetics. So I asked them, would they take my own, would they extract my own DNA and put it through the same process? So they happily did, without me signing any documents or any other kind of information needed. And I went through I documented my DNA, and these are all a series of bivalves and different creatures that have been taken out in one of the field trips we went on. And I'm I suppose in this with them, and now my DNA sits in a fridge in Porto. Well, may have been destroyed by now, but it was a process, an amazing process of just testing the boundaries at which, you know, you can step in as an artist and use your own kind of materiality to question what was happening in the lab. The other thing I was doing all the time was building hydrophones and collecting sounds. So I collected, like what becomes really clear is that science data collection becomes heavily ocular and based on data and vision. When I was hearing their stories about the pH change in the ocean, and essentially what it's doing is disintegrating the crustacean shells and the bodies of the different creatures. It's an acid, so it's dissolving the shells and calcium carbonate within the organisms in the particular ecosystem. So that kind of had a profound impact on me, and I wondered, you know, the sound in water travels in a completely different way, and we know the acoustic possibility of the species in the ocean, from a whale to small snapper shrimp. So I started building hydrophones and creating my own mesocosms, where I would dissolve shells in concentrated vinegars and different acids to see could I get an audio, what the audio sounded like. And there was a strong hiss as you kind of as this happened, and I recorded these as audio tracks. And then when it came to the final presentation to the scientists, myself and Colin, my partner, we've a music project called Headfoot. We played this back to them and created an audioscape over that, and it was a live performance to them. And I'd also clandestinely recorded their voices within the lab, and then changed the wavelengths of their voices, so you couldn't hear their the words, or you couldn't distinguish who they were. But using data from the experiments, I altered that to create a soundscape, and we played this back to them. And it was this meeting of worlds, the hiss of the dissolving ocean with the science that was sort of studying it. And it was really interesting to get their feedback, and not feedback, but it was quite, they'd never had a music or a performance like this in their kind of lab setting. But one of the scientists afterwards, came up to me and said, quite emotionally said, that he'd never put emotion to his data before. This was the first time, and it just showed for me the real power of that place that making and art making can have in how we break down these borders between knowledge structures, narratives, and so on. So yeah, I thought I had more of the images there, but they're back further. But there's some lovely and they're disintegrating all the time. So the black and white images were set with salt water as well, instead of using the chemicals that would normally be used in photographic processes. So they're actually deteriorating. So every year I scan them, and they're moving from different shades of kind of sepia to brown. So it's been a really nice journey to be on with them. And I'm working now with an invasive sea squirt with a similar process. So the second body of work comes from a show called Idir Shifting Silence. And this is a new work that I made for, well, I didn't, it comes from Idir, but the construction of it varied for this show based on the space. So this is a reed arch and wattle piece that came from the exhibition Idir, and also a cuttlefish study in epoxy with bronze cast cuttlefish. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about how these works evolved and came together. And I suppose this is the diagram that was the starting point for Idir. It's how, I suppose, on paper, I try and kind of interrogate the different materials that are coming to play, or the thinking that's coming to play, and they move through a sort of a mesh where they all relate to each other. In this kind of image, you see materials moving through processes and then on to kind of maybe the bigger kind of more analytical thinking that gives it kind of a sense of grounding for me. And then as a text piece for the show, I wanted to outline kind of the thinking behind the show, but rethink how a gallery text would look like. And this was influenced by a book called Pollution is Colonialism by Max Luan, which I recommend to anyone to read. But she has a text on essentially on pollution and also extractive processes in advanced capitalism. But the book is written heavily footnoted. So I use this as a way to kind of, as you walked into the gallery, to give you a kind of an understanding of exactly where the works came from and what the works were pointing to. So I'm just going to read a small bit of this because it kind of gives us a journey into the work that you don't necessarily get by just looking at the images. So Idir, and I'll read out like a couple of footnotes. I won't go through it all. So Idir, footnote 1. Hi there, and thanks for coming. These footnotes are an invitation into my exhibition, so welcome. The book Pollution is Colonialism by Max Luan influenced this text hospitality in ways I and the Counter Topography's feminist reading group are so grateful for. What better way to practice methodologies of care but to talk directly to you here? She tells us footnotes are a place where protocols of gratitude and recognition play out. They represent the shoulders we stand on, and there are so many. Idir, between us. The Irish word encapsulates so much about the entanglements that make up this exhibition, both human and more than human. It is made Idir, it is made between us, it's made in the mesh. Shifting Silence 2. Etel Andan talks about silence as an absence in her book of poetry by the same name. I couldn't get these words out of my head as I read Amitev Ghosh, The Nutmeg's Curse. He talks about the urgent need to give voice to those that are silenced on a planet in crisis. Who have we silenced, and how can we shift them, Idir, so voices are heard? Silencing appears again and again as something to unknot through the materials in this exhibition. Textiles, for example. So few early examples exist in the great history museums of swords and stones, but we know they predate those artifacts. Perhaps you're reading this standing under the reed arches, another silence material, disintegrating and re-emerging in the great cycles of life as our species built shelters that said so much about our custom, culture, and land relations. If you're still in the gallery, you're standing on the floodplains of the River Liffey. And it was very poetic to have these works in Luan, because of course you're standing on the floodplains of the River Shannon. The reed arches are there in more detail. The marsh, the old. If you're still in the gallery, you're standing on the floodplains of the old River Liffey, the old marshlands from which the wattle bridge was first made to cross the great river at low tide, Baile Clia, the town of the hurdled ford. I'm lucky to have met the Thatcher Kieran O'Grady, who was willing to share old wisdoms and share the stories of the marsh Arabs and low-tech wetland living. I'm equally grateful to have journeyed through Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmer while preparing for this show. She breathes wisdom into a world drowning in information. It's impossible not want to delve deeper. So then I open with a small text from the written work that came with the show. "What are you doing there, head-footed one?" asked the Morrigan, lying as bone, engulfed in silence, like the water that washed your shape-shifting figure. "And I've been scraping in this weedy present, waiting for a new world. The spell we all know is coming." So just to move on to number 4. So in this exhibition, you're encountering a cuttlefish, cephalopod from the Greek head foot, the great shapeshifter of the ocean, appearing as cast bones and as a window to view through. The ocean, as an otherworldly sensorium, has become a place I dive into to shake up the bad habits of terrestrial thinking. It dazzles you and makes you think sideways. Cephalopods have always been that creature for me. We're separated by 600 million years, but our dimensions of consciousness expand. But as our dimensions of consciousness expand, it's clear they are kin. The place they occupy in mythology nods to a time when people were deeply connected to and acknowledged the power of the more than human world. Read Rachel Carson's The Sea Around Us and Godfrey Smith's Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea and the Origins of Consciousness. The Morrigan, another shapeshifter, is the great queen in Irish mythology, appearing as a crow, read Taine. I had the great fortune to meet Nicola S. Clayton, the professor of comparative cognition in the University of Cambridge, as I began observing the clever corvids. Her lab teaches us that they are the feathered apes, matching primates in cognition. The place they occupy in mythology again tells us our ancestors were fully aware of this. We talked a lot about nonverbal communication, how wordless thoughts can capture things humans have difficulty thinking about. Listening generously with full senses aware can be a powerful tool for reconnecting the bird mentor Christy Dragney told me. Read Identify Any Bird Anywhere. Her voice and the skill of Calmo Kisoig allows the Morrigan to be heard. So I'll just jump on. So that's the cuttlefish bone there, cast in bronze. If you've ever seen a cuttlefish bone or held it, you'll notice these dendritic patterns. So almost like a fingerprint, each cuttlefish bone is different. And they're really beautiful in texture, and casting it in bronze was it was sand casted in Leitrim Sculpture Centre. So I amazingly managed to get this level of detail on it, which I didn't originally think was possible with the help of the technicians there. But if you, in our terrestrial world, I'll just go to number 6 because it's a nice kind of nod to this. If you've ever held a cuttlefish bone, you'll recognize the dendritic patterns, the fingerprint or head footprints of this creature. In our terrestrial world, our head-footed and feathered kin have been entangled in cages, where the bones of these oceanic shapeshifters are left to sharpen the beaks of the feathered ones. A strange entanglement, right? Nikki Clayton's research has pushed both corvids and cuttlefish to the forefront of sentient studies. Both kin time travel, communicating without words, and have a better understanding of time and space than us. Yet we increasingly push them to the limits of survival. And I'd recommend reading Nikki's Dimensions of Animal Consciousness if that's something that you're interested in taking further. So this was just something that really intrigued me about this kind of entanglements that exist in the terrestrial world, that in bird cages, cuttlefish bones are left to sharpen their beaks, and yet in her lab, and it was kind of an amazing kind of, I suppose, this feeling that a homecoming meeting Nikki, because she was studying both of these species in her lab, and looking at the high level of intelligence in both species based on kind of memory, time travel. So with Nikki, and then with this bird specialist from the US who I met through a series of kind of online kind of interactions, we created an audio piece that I'm going to play a little bit of now, and this was in the lab gallery, and it gives you. So in the gallery. Sugar, sorry. See, in the lab gallery, it was in a dark room, and I suppose I was asking for the bird to be called forth through your own voice. So you'll hear it now, but you were asked, and feel free at home now or wherever you are to take part in it, but you were asked to mimic the call of the bird with Christy. And it was this very silent gallery space with the reed arches creating this kind of feeling of a wetland. And then in the dark room, you'd hear these calls coming out of the other room, and it felt very special and felt like a proper entanglement. So if it doesn't keep jumping, I will play it.
Can you hear that sound behind me? Yeah, there it is. Is it a raven? Or is it a crow? I know, a lot of people want to know that answer. Well, there's a few ways you can tell. One is by the voice. So, listen for that sound we're hearing right now. Ooh, that's different. Okay, this is great. They're both here right now. So I want you to practice these sounds for yourself. So when people wonder how to tell the difference between a raven or a crow, the first thing to do is listen for the voice. And so we just heard two different sounds. One was more high-pitched, that first sound, and the second one was deeper. Now, try this within yourself, okay? In your own voice, try and make the sound that we heard first. That one's a bit more high-pitched, so it goes something like this. Ah, ah, ah. Ah, 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 right? Now that second sound that we heard, that's coming from a bit deeper in my throat. It's more guttural. Let's try that. Ow, ow, ow. Right? So when the sound comes from there, that's the raven. When it comes from high up here in your head, like those right there, that's the crow. But I would just say, just listen for a little while and see if you can hear their voice and then mimic it. Is it the crow or the raven? That was the crow. That's great.
Sorry. So go back. Yeah, so the final part of that work. So in the gallery in Luan, you saw the cuttlefish bones cast in bronze, and also the cuttlefish window. So in the studio, I began dissolving in a similar way to the Porto show. I began dissolving the cuttlefish bones it's a material called aragonite, and I began dissolving them in a high concentration of vinegar. And what you're left with is the individual layers. The calcium carbonate dissolves, and you're left with that aragonite layer. And I was using pigments, making a pigment out of woad, which is the great kind of herbal plant that was used as a shape-shifting ink in our kind of ancestral world. So I used woad to dye parts of the pigment and then created this epoxy window. So you're looking through the cuttlefish, you're looking through a cuttlefish window through the reeds, and then you're left with this final note in the text piece, which is in Gaeilge. So it's the last section of the text, but it's a spell poem. And I'll just read the footnote on that. Spell poems are poetry, and poetry are spells. They take us to a world where words influence the universe. Cumulative storytelling and spell making are thinking practices that are in motion. Like speculative fictions, they are conceiving of all entities and beings as interconnected and entangle them to word build together. Isn't that fucking great and needed? Sinead, a spell poem in a silenced language that has the power to reimagine the inevitability of things. Journeying through Gaeilge has continually allowed me to reimagine the world and world build with hope, helping me shift silences and storytell in motion. Now build a nest and listen. And this is the final spell poem. Clucum agus uscléim, ach tatus greva, dúntas an amal láthir, dainad agus éist le smínta gan focail le cead fadúise agus siúlf míad le céile a ríis. And I think probably, yeah, it's 22. So I think maybe I'll leave it there rather than, yeah, the Morgan appeared again in a work in CIIMAR, which you can find out it was a really nice project with Shannon Carroll, where I took the lead from that show, and then we created this audio sound walk around CIIMAR in the formal gardens. You can see them here highlighted in blue. It's not live anymore, but hopefully we'll get it up again. But it was a bilingual sound walk that deconstructed these formal gardens with a kind of a methodology of care and an anti-colonial methodology, rethinking that space. And then again, I've just finished a work with Nicola from Cambridge, and hopefully working with her in the next year, just on a proper kind of corvid cuttlefish project that will, not proper, but an expansion of the one that I got to work on last year, where I go to her lab and work on site. But we've just done a lovely piece for the BBC if anyone's interested in her research. I have a small part to play in it, but it's really a kind of walkthrough of her research in her lab, and it's on BBC Radio 3. I think I'll leave it there. Is anyone there?
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rosie. That was really, really, really fascinating. And I have a little notebook of scribbles of things to bring up. But I suppose if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, you can pop it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you if you'd like to speak your question. Whilst people are formulating that, just the predominant thought that was going through my head when you were talking about your practice, and it's funny, like having worked together, you know, it's funny how things can really just culminate in your mind and kind of tick away, and then it takes a moment for that connection to be made. But the connection I made was how a lot of your work focuses on extraction as shape-shifting, and extraction as potentiality, I suppose, counter to methods of extraction that are so predominant in capitalist within capitalist frameworks. So as opposed to extraction for capitalist gain, for commodification, you're looking at extraction for potentiality and for progress, and the ways that you use that through like extraction of mediums, extraction of pigment, extraction of like kelp and cuttlefish dye, conceptual extraction. I think it's really interesting, and really you're quite proliferate in how you use that. And to bring it back to the text that I wrote for Athrú, I feel like your work is certainly encapsulates that level of potentiality that shape-shifting and change can give. So I'll just read a little paragraph from the text for Athrú and Invocation. Athrú, the Irish word meaning to change, transform, or alter the course, summons forward Ireland's ancient language, a reminder of the heritage of the lands we inhabit and of the creeping threat of linguistic extinction of the Gaelic language. Though the aftermath of colonial rule is ever present in post-colonial Ireland, our Indigenous mother tongue perseveres. As imperial forces plunder our planet in a seemingly unstoppable manner, and the lives that share this earth are threatened, we may look to the endurance of the Gaelic language as a source of hope that strength can be found in unity, that the powers that imperil us can be fought, that through passion and perseverance we can enact real change. Ultimately, the power to invoke ecological transformation lies within us. From that, the point that I was saying all that to get to was I was going to ask you if you're familiar with Iris Rogoff.
With?
Iris Rogoff.
No.
So Iris Rogoff is a visual culture theorist, writer and curator, and she has this wonderful term, smuggling, right? So when smuggling. So she writes about smuggling in the sense that it's a way of kind of deviating from the hierarchy of exchange and ownership, and to deviate from the framework that a capitalist society exists upon. So as opposed to the capitalist forms of exchange that we rely upon, which do kind of seep into our exchange of knowledges and our exchange of ideas, to deviate from that framework of exchange and instead to smuggle things. So similar in a way to art activism has come to the fore in the last 20 years. That could be seen as a way of smuggling activism and political and social change into the visual arts. And I suppose it's always a contentious issue when, art activism is brought up, and I suppose there's successes and failures within it. But I think that there's methods of smuggling socio-political action through visual artworks, which I see quite present in your practice.
Yeah, sorry, is that a question, or we'll just
we'll
just go for it. Yeah, well, I think the primary goal for me is like to always be a little bit confused. Like to know you're nowhere near a linear thought pattern. Like, so I suppose that's why I've decided to find this kind of place, like a mesh place, which you could definitely say you can smuggle in a mesh, and because there's gray areas. That's the purpose of it. Nothing's clear, nothing's defined, everything's slightly, like, I kind of always, if you swim in the sea and you go under the water, you change your sensorium and suddenly everything dazzles you, like everything's slightly skewed and kind of, if you open your eyes, nothing is as it seems. And I think art allows you to strive for that place in a way that goes beyond kind of the modes of thinking that exist in our regular kind of in what we now know as extractive capitalism, which is very much defined by point A getting to point B, and the quickest and more profitable way to get there. It's like our practice allows you to create a space where you can create a way of doing and a way of making and a way of thinking that is completely counter to that. And yeah, I can totally see how, in my head, I'm just trying to like think of now, the idea of, I'm thinking of an octopus, like the way I always think about how like a cephalopod moves with its brain and its tentacles and can move. That means it can think in 8 directions at one time. Like, there's never been a better smuggler than an octopus. Renowned for its way of its sense of possibility and being tentacular. So yeah, I would say that that's like one of the roles that, yeah, I'll read. Can you spell her name?
Yeah, actually what I'll do is I'll actually just link the paper that she wrote about smuggling into the chat.
That'd be great.
So if anybody else is interested, I would highly recommend it. It's fascinating reading, and she's just a little bit of a genius, in my opinion. But a really good starting point for people to think about ways in which knowledges can be formed outside of the traditional framework of there being a hierarchical educational system based on linguistics, you know, to look more towards the effectual or embodied knowledges as well. One moment now, my screen is acting up. Cool, I'll pop that into the chat if anybody's interested. Sorry, I actually can't find the chat. I'll have it emailed out anyway. I'm having an elder moment.
That's loud. Oh, there, look.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. No.
I'd like to know your name of the book you mentioned. Oh yeah. Let's see. Oh, it's Sophie. Anyone can put on the camera if they want. At this point, I got completely unnerved at the beginning, just seeing like names. It was weird. So it's pollution is colonialism. Oh, can't put my camera on. Okay, sorry.
That's that.
Pollution is colonialism. I think that's the book. Mentioned about it is Extraction. Yeah, it's a brilliant book by Max, and she's got a lab in Newfoundland called the Clear Lab. So she has a science lab that practices anti-colonial methodologies of care to the species that they study. So they're looking at plastics being ingested by plastics. Hi, Sophie. Plastics being ingested by bird populations in the Newfoundland coast. But they have methodologies of care in how they enact the science within their lab. So even when it comes down to the remains of the birds, they're offered back to the land with the indigenous communities, and it's like phenomenal methodology. It's a methods book, but from an artist point of view, look, if you're thinking about extraction in your kind of practices, it's just a shake up. Like, it's a shake up on everything, but yeah, it's brilliant.
Amazing, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't put on my camera earlier, but
it's nice to see you, Sophie.
You too. Really great presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh God, I don't know. I think at the beginning I just realized I was looking at a load of words. I was like, what? It's just when you know, I know I forgot, because Zoom is I haven't done a Zoom in ages, because we're back doing face-to-facey. Anyway. How are you, Sophie? Good. Are you in London?
In London, yeah. Good.
Get in touch.
Yeah, we should.
Any other questions? A practical question. Did you get your work with the scientists in Porto? I might have missed that. No, I just found I found the lab and I emailed them. So literally just I was doing an MA through ARC, and wanted to kind of do 3 months away in 2018, 2019. So I contacted this lab knowing they were studying invasive species in that part of Porto, and knowing the kind of trade links from there, global, but also between Ireland and Portugal. So it was just a reach out, and then ended up getting the right scientist who was on for a chat on Zoom, and then it just went from there.
Brilliant. It's actually incredible what can happen when you just kind of put the feelers out.
Yeah, totally. That, like, the woman in America who did the audio piece for me, I just found this gorgeous video she did on YouTube. She's in a forest and she's got a little camera and she's just literally studying crows and ravens. And I contacted her to see could I use that audio, and then we just kind of tuned in over that. And it was similar with Nikki, who's become a really good friend in Cambridge University. Just reached out to her because of her research. So yeah, I think it's like things always come around, the connections, they feel like they're out there, and then I think once you just go for it, they all start kind of coming together. So
yeah, it's beautiful to see little communities and little connections form and just spider web off.
Yeah. So
Laura just asked there as well, was it the ARC Erasmus? She's doing ARC at the moment.
Yeah, you can go on if you're doing ARC. So it was through a friend actually, she was the Erasmus officer in NCAD at the time. So she just told me, yeah, you can apply for Erasmus as part of that MA, as any MA. So I just they'd never done it before, but if they'll know the program, and yeah, you have to sort out the residency, but you get like a small amount of funding towards your accommodation and whatnot. I think you can do 2 terms or 1 term. I did 1 term away.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I find that usually you can kind of figure out a way to do almost anything you want to do underneath the Erasmus scheme, as long as it makes sense and you word it correctly and you get the, lecturers, tutors, whatever on board. A lot of the time, it's quite unfounded territory. It's something that they may not have worked with, or a place they may not have worked with, but it's always possible. So always just give it a try. Just because it's not been done before doesn't mean it can't be done. Lovely. Any more questions from anybody? Rosie, do you have any questions?
No, I don't. Well, no, I'm done talking. Unless it's a question.
I was going to say as well, I love how you speak about embodied knowledges in the text around your work. And I think that's something that has become quite a cultural zeitgeist in the last short number of years. People are really starting to become more attuned to collective knowledges and embodied knowledges and knowledges that are found within themselves that are pre-linguistic. Like before we speak, before we can even formulate these things into words, it's a felt knowledge, and through my own research into affect theory, and how it relates to visual art, I would always say that visual art is pre-linguistic philosophy and criticality. So before we can siphon down something into something as refined as language, visual arts allows the more expansive kind of way of expressing that pathic knowledge.
Nikki Clayton in her lab would be looking at gestural communication within Corvids. So she's a dancer, and she's actually she's scientist in residence in a dance studio in the UK for the first time, and they've developed a dance based on bird movements, like a bird tango. So she studies non-gestural or gestural and non-verbal communication within birds and cuttlefish, and I think that kind of nods to the assumptions that we presume language give us. But when you look in the more than human world, that becomes clear. It becomes clearly evident that the different varied ways of communicating are so evident.
Absolutely. I think perhaps people will look more towards the communication line of things between humans to say, oh, well, like what they say, like something like 90% of communication actually isn't spoken. But I suppose when it comes to listening to yourself, communicating with yourself and understanding your own truth and your own knowledges and how that resounds within the world around you, I think that's something people are starting to look at more, which is wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting as well in relation to development of AI. So at which point did we assume that even like consciousness is solely human related? And now thinking about it in artificial technologies, I think it's going to come in a lot more into just other materials. Because as long as there are materials, or as long as we are in physical bodies, we'll need materials to physically relate to.
Yeah, absolutely. I always really have to laugh at like the presumptuous ego of humans, that the human centric, like even the Anthropocene is human centered, like decimation of the earth, which is gas, because we're really just a tiny little speck. Lovely. So if nobody has any more questions, or is there any last thoughts before we wrap up, because it is nearly 1 o'clock. Perfect. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us during your lunchtime. And thank you, Rosie, so much for your brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'll have a lot whirring through my mind now for the afternoon, I'm sure.
Okay, good.
Thank you. Bye.
Luan.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.